Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors and contributors of Strategy Page discuss current events and other military-related topics with a splash of history. I'm your host, Dan Masterson. Joining us today is Jim Dunnigan, editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author, and acknowledged pioneer and innovator in board war games. Also joining us today is Austin Bay, associate editor of Strategy Page, military author, columnist, and retired Colonel, U.S. Army Reserves. Welcome, Austin and Jim. Thought we'd talk a little bit about China today. There's a lot of different things to talk about with them. Let's start with the protests. Jim, what's this current situation with the protests there in China over the COVID?
Officially, China has stopped the lockdowns. But they took names. They arrested a lot of people, and based upon past performance, say in Hong Kong, they're going to eventually prosecute some of these people. So they basically don't, add fuel to the fire immediately, but they want to let Chinese know that they will eventually, pay the price, as it were. China, of course, by stopping that, they've had more cases of the latest version of COVID, which spreads faster but is less lethal. And that the Chinese say that's a problem because they haven't got enough drugs, to deal with it. But they're also dealing with the annual flu season, and a lot of people consider, the current version of COVID not much worse than the a bad flu season. So right now they're really concentrating on dealing with the flu, and they'll come back to COVID later.
Austin, what are the long-term ramifications of the protests? Is there going to be any political fallout there in China?
Well, there's already been some, Dan. It's been really startling political fallout, at least within China's context, because Xi Jinping backed down. I'm not exactly sure how many people were in total lockdown. The Chinese government may know, but they had several major cities and also some of the production sites out in Xinjiang province, but parts of Shanghai, other parts of in North China. You had people locked in their apartment buildings, not just kept in a zone, but locked in their apartment buildings. There were reports verified, many of them verified, of people going several days without food because they weren't allowed to go shopping. And there were some sectors, too, that just weren't even resupplied. And you had men in hazmat suits, probably local police, but tough to identify. Some of them were I'd say, definitely riot police because they were carrying riot shields, enforcing this harsh lockdown. And it was endless, and it reached a point where you had Chinese citizens in several places, but including in the big towns where people were taking photos, video with their cell phones, out with makeshift weapons, fighting the men in hazmat suits, breaking windows, and in some cases, calling for the downfall of Xi Jinping. Something you don't do, especially in the aftermath. Just because remember, 6-7 weeks ago, Xi Jinping was being really crowned emperor for essentially the rest of his life. He's the number one leader in China. He ditched the Deng Xiaoping notion of collective leadership in the Chinese Communist Party. He's it. He's the new Mao. But as Jim keeps calling him an emperor, and I think that's a better way to look at it because that's the way the Chinese look at it. But they got the emperor to back down. They got the emperor to end the lockdown policies, zero COVID. And remember, here in the United States and also in places in Europe, you had elements, political elements here and in Europe who agreed with Xi Jinping. Everybody's got to wear a mask all the time, stay at home, avoid contact, don't go to work. And they even invoked China as Xi Jinping's China as an example for the rest of the world. Well, it's not. Chinese people had it. Had it with him. If I said 25 to 35 million people, and again I said it was tough to estimate, I think that's fairly accurate. You can see that's China has about 1.4 billion or 1.35 billion people, but that's still a lot of people in major cities. And one of the chief places where there was a lot of activity was at the Foxconn plant that makes Apple iPhones. So that's the short term, is the emperor back down, and that's the short term takeaway. And the long term takeaway is the emperor back down. And we've discussed this numerous times about Tiananmen Square in a couple of books. I've used the term the Tiananmen tiger that stalks the Chinese Communist Party, is because they're caught in a dilemma. If they want a modern, creative economic system, they're going to have to permit modern free communications and free thought. But Deng, what he called opening up and reform, those were goals, and those we're going to have policies. China's going to have policies that encourage economic development, economic freedom within his socialist system. But he also had cardinal principles, which were the party, chief among them, the party stays in power. The party controls everything. And there's just an absolutely fundamental clash between them. And at the short takeaway and long takeaway is that we're seeing those two so-called major principles in Chinese Communist Party clash, and they don't work well together. So I think that answers your question about what the big takeaways were. The short term is loss of face for Xi Jinping. The long term is, once again, we see that communist China has deeply embedded problems that stem from the political structure of their country.
Jim, let's talk about the next thing that's been going on in China. China's been rattling its landing craft towards Taiwan. What is the concern there, and are they really serious this time about maybe invading the island?
Well, they say they are, but they can't. As we pointed out in the strategy page, how should I put it? The geography of the situation favors the Taiwanese. Now, the Chinese are also developing a new version of their DF-12 short-range ballistic missile to be more accurate and be able to hit, precise, Taiwanese targets. The Taiwanese responded by saying, "Well, we're going to build more fortified, enclosures on the reverse slope. In other words, the slope the one that's harder to hit when you launch a missile from China." China says their new missile can take care of that, while it remains to be seen. I don't think China wants to take the chance, because you got to remember, Xi has all power now, but he also has all responsibility. And the social contract with China since the 1980s is that the people don't get involved in politics as long as they prosper. They're not prospering. The total shutdown was a huge hit on the economy. As Austin pointed out, the Foxconn operation was shut down. Not only was it shut down, most of the employees were shut down inside the facility. So they were starving in their workplace, and they basically staged a mass breakout. They basically took off, and a lot of them didn't come back. So Foxconn has a labor problem. In fact, China in general has a labor problem because they're still suffering from the one-child policy. The new generation is smaller. They can't find enough recruits for the military, and they basically can't find enough people to keep the economy running like it used to. And the shutdowns hurt the economy even more. So, Xi had a problem with his power is dependent upon keeping the economy going. His policies did just the opposite. And that's why the calls for Xi's, replacement carried a lot of weight, because it's him, not the Communist Party, that is getting in the way of the Chinese prosperity, which basically allows the Communist Party and the entrepreneurs to coexist. A lot of the entrepreneurs, the wealthier ones, the ones who could afford it, and we've mentioned this before, have already bought passports. There are countries where you can buy a passport if you bring enough money in. Canada used to be like that. So they can escape. They've illegally moved money offshore. In other words, they are abandoning the ship because they don't have any more confidence in Xi's policy. And of course, the COVID shutdowns were an example of that. The problem with COVID is the current version, is a lot less, lethal. Like I said, it's more like, a bad flu year. But the Chinese don't see it that way. They feel that as long as COVID is spreading, they are at risk. Well, they're at more risk if they hurt the economy. So they're really caught in a conundrum there. Another problem with the COVID is more research is going on the gain of function activities, which were apparently partially funded by the United States. We can thank Mr. Fauci for that. They weren't supposed to basically make the COVID or the SARS they were working on virus worse, but they did. And that's what got released. It got loose in 2019. The Chinese denied it. They tried to blame it on the United States without much success. But, if they repeat the lie often enough, they get some believers. And now they are perpetually, in fear of these epidemic diseases, causing panic among the population and restricting the economic growth even more. As it is, the economic growth took a major hit. It's still growing, but it's like growing like 1-2%, if that, in 2022, and it may not do much better in 2023. So the Xi's major vulnerability is his inability to deliver the economic benefits that justify his power, and that's why he backed down so quickly, and he hasn't really got a solution yet. He's just hoping it'll go over. It'll be over. People will forget. Well, the people don't forget because they're basically worse off economically, and it's not getting any better under Xi. So that's his big problem, and he hasn't got a solution, at least not one he's come up with yet. Now, overseas, he's still basically weaponizing the South China Sea. He's still got, the skirmishing with India over the major disputes. One, of course, involves an entire province in northeastern India. And they are being aggressive in general around the world. They're using their, how should I put it, monetary diplomacy to gain as much influence as they can. Unfortunately, they not only gain influence, they gain enemies. A lot of countries, resent China basically trying to buy their way into the infrastructure. The Philippines was a good example of that. For a while, during the previous Philippines regime under Duterte, he tried to make deals with China in return for concessions in the South China Sea in return for economic investment. He didn't get any economic investment. There was more, how should I put it, occupations in the South China Sea. And now his successor, President Marcos, was he the son or the grandson of the dictator, the previous Filipino dictator? He's taken a hard line because he realized that China cannot be placated by any agreement they make. So China is making more enemies. They have to get that economy going. Without that economic growth, they have an internal enemy. And the internal enemy is growing the more the economy stumbles. And that's a problem that Xi is apparently trying to concentrate on now, while not forgetting, his overseas accomplishments, which basically don't do much to help the economy.
Austin, what's the threat to Taiwan?
Well, I think Jim says that the communist Chinese, mainland Chinese, have several real operational problems in getting across the Taiwan Strait. Taiwan is threatened by missile drizzle, but we saw that in the mid 1990s, 95 and 96. Experiment with that, splashing missile warheads in the sea around Taiwan to send the message that we are ready to actually slam the island. And they have built up their short-range and intermediate-range ballistic missiles, built up their cruise missile inventory to imply that they would attack Taiwan, and really in a way that Russia's cruise missile attrition strategy would be, as the Russians are attempting to do that to Ukraine. It was not the Russians' intention to do that. They were going to blitzkrieg with a special operation, but they've ended up the slugfest, where in the tactical level, for the most part, it's artillery, but for the operational, and even the Russians are after a strategic victory by hitting all the infrastructure and slamming the cities, blowing up apartment buildings. The Chinese have implied they could do that to Taiwan. Well, I've been to Taiwan twice. It's a big rock. They on the western side, the nationalist Chinese, I'll call them that, but Taiwanese have dug out air bases and caverns. It's somewhat similar to what the Swiss have with their redoubts in the Alps, where suddenly a big metal door opens and out rolls a jet fighter aircraft that uses the highway you're on as driving on as its runway. And that's I've seen that happen, not the takeoff, but the plane come out and sit there, and then what the Swiss do is shut down the highway. So as the pilot takes off, they've got that on the western side, which is part of the way that the looking back 20 plus years ago, the Taiwanese were going to attempt to stop a Chinese amphibious operation and airborne operation to cross the strait. Well, the Taiwanese have gotten smart too. They're putting in more anti-ship missiles. I'm sure in process now. They're buying more drones, but they're also, and this is something Jim's talked about several times, in the mining business, and I mean sea mines. And that is something that their major allies, Japan, the United States, Australia, are interested in assisting them in, which is mining the strait, so that virtually anything that seems to come across on the surface or subsurface is going to have an extremely hard time as the sea explodes around them. So they have not. Taiwanese have not said that they're going to utilize a porcupine strategy, which is what I've described there. They're going to, they still have forces as if they're going to fight it out head to head with the Chinese, and even up until the last decade, forces that you could see being used in an offensive manner for the Taiwanese to go across the strait. They don't have the capability to do it. But when Kuomintang, old Kuomintang was in power, that was something that they would, at least when saber rattling occurred, imply that they were prepared to do. In other words, Chiang Kai-shek returns to the mainland. So Taiwan is prepared, and also I should say their air and missile defenses. They are trying to improve, or in the process of improving their air and missile defenses. And you can see with what Ukraine has done in a more or less ad hoc fashion, what a sound integrated anti-air, anti-missile defense can accomplish. You can frustrate the missile drizzle operation that the mainland Chinese, the Chinese communists, have implied they would try to prosecute on Taiwan. Now, all right, there I'm kind of mixed, tactical, mostly operational, but the strategic situation for Taiwan has improved a great deal with the thanks to the bad behavior of the Beijing regime. Japan is rearming, up its defense budget, modernizing, and the Japanese self-defense forces, as they're called, really had a great deal. They've modernized and have offensive weapons. The U.S., I don't know how much we're pivoting to Asia, but we're certainly aware that we've got to improve the Navy, build up the Navy, I guess is what I want to say, and work with Japan, Taiwan, and Australia in keeping the Chinese pinned to their coast so they don't break through that first island chain. But the big thing is India. We've talked about this before, but I'll quickly sketch the origins of the Quad. 2007, Japan had been working on this, saying, look, in a bilateral way with the Indians, we have lots in common. You, the Indians, want to pursue your own strategic independence, but the big problem is China. And the United States, Japan, we, the Japanese, and Australia know it's the big problem. And Japan, Australia, United States cooperate very closely. So does South Korea. I'll put that in there. But in Japan, Australia, and the United States have great interest in Taiwanese independence and forcing Beijing to behave militarily in East Asia. But then India and Japan and China, are still at war, because the 1962 Sino-Indian War really hadn't ended, even though they had some very serious negotiations 20 years ago, and then again 11 years ago. Let's make a permanent border, and let's not punch it out with each other anymore with these flare-ups, both in the West, Pakistan, India, Tibet border region, but then, as Jim was pointing out, in the East, in the eastern provinces, where Tibet comes into Arunachal Pradesh, the Indian state. And just last week, December the 9th, we had another clash between India and China in the East, where the Chinese have already built these roads to support an invasion to the south. Well, the Indians are now building modernized roads to come up to reinforce that sector, and the Chinese have been trying to stop or hinder Indian road network, and also Indian modernization of some of its defensive areas. That's a better way to describe it than regional defenses in the pass area. Now, this time nobody got hurt. Last time there was a major flare up there, at least 20 Indian soldiers were killed. Chinese figures on the number were killed in 2020 was anywhere from 4 to 40. Not sure, but it was a shootout. And no, it's too simple to say Beijing, Xi Jinping, in order to divert domestic attention, goes and starts rattling sabers. But that is something that dictatorships do. And the scrape on December the 9th got a lot of coverage in Asia, as it should. Two large nations in Asia, actually the most populous in the world, are both nuclear armed, and their armies are fighting over the an important area of a pass that if one wanted to go south, the Chinese would want to pour soldiers and men and material through the pass to go and take Indian states to the south, or if the Indians were trying to return the favor and go back into Tibet, go the other way. In other words, it is an area that has real military significance for operations between India and China. And so it happened. It's something that people in China will pay attention to. For the most part, the Chinese are proud of what their country has done, with the retaking Tibet and the like, and they're suspicious of India. So there's the neighbor the enemy next door. Ploy by Xi Jinping's regime to deflect domestic heat. It's also very possible, and I said in a column I wrote about it, that because the area is so complex that it was an accident. Except it's tough to say it's an accident when they both know where the border's not drawn, but they call the line of actual control, and they know where it is. They hold meetings. The senior officers in the area hold meetings on a semi-regular basis to discuss where their positions are, where their troops are, and where that dividing line is. And the Chinese came across into where the Indians were building this road. The effect is, after even I know I've been talking tactical here, but the Indians know what the Japanese diplomats said in 2007. Our interests lie with Japan, Australia, and the United States in containing China, because China is the belligerent and bad actor. And we had another example of it just on the heels of another one of these major probes of Taiwan air defense identification zone with over 20 armed Chinese bombers, and they were reason to believe they were armed, that were violating Taiwanese airspace. So the Chinese threat is real, and that Xi Jinping is a dictator who would use a military foray to try to galvanize support for his regime, even though there's a great deal of discontent, as Jim says, about the economy, but also about the lack of no freedom, lack of rights.
Well, we'll wrap it up there, and we'll look forward to talking to you gentlemen just before the year ends. See you then.
Bye.